Hi, this is Jerry Walker, coming at you again today. I'm from Walker Welding. I'm going to give you a demonstration on some of the techniques of MIG welding. To start with, in the demonstration, I'll show you the machine I'm using is the Lincoln 180, run off of 220. And if you look at your settings inside the door, it tells you what you should be set on. Today I'm going to be welding on 14 gauge material, and this 14 gauge material is showing you on the inside your door here. On 14 gauge material, you should be running your voltage on around C and your wire speed on around 4. I tend to run a little bit hotter on stuff I weld on, and that's given with more years of experience doing it. But once you get comfortable with it, you probably can too. I usually run mine on D on most of the 14, 11 gauge, stuff like that. And I run my wire speed just under 4. I burn a little bit hotter, and sometimes it's good for some people, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you want to go to the actual desired setting that the machine tells you, and that may be comfortable for you. It's a good thing to start out with. You can start out with that, and like I demonstrated in a earlier video we made as far as how to adjust the tension on your wire, feeding your wire. Once you get everything set up like you want it, then you can go from there. In this demonstration, I'm going to show you I'm going to show you 2 different techniques. First thing, on fitting up metals, whenever I fit up plates, stuff like that, when it's feasible to use, we use this Adjusto magnet square. They make them in various sizes. This is one of the smaller size, and it's good for a 45 degree or a 90 degree. And what it does, it gives you a perfect 90 degree square. And it has an on and off for the magnet on it, and it works really great. You can pick them up at your local welding supply. You can pick them up other places also. We use our welding supply to buy these. It's Alamo Welding here in Austin, Texas, and it's a great place to deal with. It's a great company. They've always stood behind every product they sell, and we've been very, very happy with everything we've bought from them. And with that being said, now I'm going to get into this welding part of it. I'm going to give you a demonstration first on doing what we call a T-butt weld. On this T-butt weld, I'm going to give you a demonstration on how you run and what you're looking for in a MIG gun, especially if you're running with the gas. Like I said, the 75-25 gas, a solid wire, what we call a hard wire. If you're running with that, what you want to be listening for, it sounds almost like bacon frying. So whenever you hear that sound, you know you're pretty well doing right. What we're going to look for now, I'm going to show you how you start out running what we call a bead or a stringer, running that into that joint. Then on the next demonstration, I'm going to show you how we do a pulse weld. You can do a pulse weld even if you don't have a machine that's set up for pulse welding. And all it is controlled by how much you mash in the trigger. And on a pulse weld, what the pulse weld is good for, if you're joining 2 pieces of metal together, if it's a thinner metal, and most times if you join the 2 pieces of metal together like that, you want to join it together, and then you want to come back and buff it down smooth where you don't see a weld. You want it to be a complete seamless looking joint. On thinner metal, you're not able to bevel it down because there's nothing there to start with. So if you're using a pulse weld, you can turn that heat up and burn it in, penetrating into the metal deeper to where you're getting more depth into the weld, and it makes it a lot stronger seam. Then that way, once you do come back and bump it down, you still have a strong joint. So now I'm gonna get into this right here where we're doing the actual welding of it, and maybe let's give you some insight on it. And as always, remember, knowledge is power. The more knowledge you have on this, the more power you have. And like always, you know, if you see something that you are questionable about, feel free to give me a comment on that, or ask me a question. And now we're gonna get into this right here. In this technique, what I'm gonna be doing what we call a pull technique. Halfway, and then we're gonna come back, we're gonna do a push technique, the other half. These particular plates I've already got fit up, ready to go. So first thing, like I said, we're gonna do the pull technique. Okay, on that you'll notice my wire, I'm moving very little, up and down, up and down. You don't have to move a whole lot. You don't want to burn deep into this other metal, but you'll notice it leaves you a fairly nice weld. Have a fairly nice weld there from that. Now we're gonna come back on this side and we're gonna do the push technique. Okay. Okay, that's your push technique. And you'd ask, you say, well, why would I be doing a push technique or a pull technique? Sometimes it may depend on your wind condition. Whether you got a windy condition, you need to push or to pull. That's mainly where it matters at, because if it's in a windier condition, you may get better gas coverage by pushing, or you may get better gas coverage by pulling. But you're still achieving, by your up and down, just slight up and down movement of that wire, to where you can achieve a decent looking weld. With that being said, now I'm going to switch right over here, and I'm going to do the same thing. On this side, I'm going to do the push first. That's giving you a demonstration on the pulse welding. On the pulse welding, like I said, each time you hit the trigger, you're only there for just like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And you're hitting the trigger off and on, off and on, off and on, off and on. And what you're doing is you're feeding that wire into that puddle each time, but it's giving it just a second to cool some, where you're not constantly burning in, where if it was a thinner gauge metal than this 14 gauge, if you was on a 16 gauge or an 18 gauge metal that's very thin, if you was constantly welding on it, it would burn it out. Now, that being said, I'm going to show you that on the pulse welding. Okay, on the pulse welding, you're not really having to move up and down so much. With your wire, it's just a constant bead in there. You're just a constant pulse. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. All right, now I'm gonna do it the same way with the pulling. Instead of the pushing, we're gonna do the pulling. You would ask again, like I said, you kind of wonder why am I using the pull, the push? It's like I said, the same thing as far as like whether you're against the wind, how you get better gas coverage. And you'll notice like the darker weld here, the shinier weld here, I'm getting better coverage over here from my gas because of the wind conditions. I'm getting better gas speed over here. When it's darker like that, you're getting less gas speed because you're pulling away from the gas, whereas the gas is pushing in on this side where it's pushing it. But, like I said, on this pulse welding, you say, well, why would you need pulse welding? Like I said, if you was doing a seamless, you want to do a seamless outside corner right here, and you pulse welded that in, then you come out and buff it down, you never see that corner. You can never tell where the corner was at. And that's the whole benefit of being able to pulse weld it, or like I said, doing a continuous run. Same thing there on the continuous running. You see a shinier weld where I'm pushing it, I'm getting better coverage off of my gas. I'm pulling it, I'm getting less coverage. I'm still making a good weld, but I'm getting less coverage from my gas itself. Makes a darker weld. You can buff it down. You're still having the same strength, the same weld metal. It's just a lot of times you're desiring to get that shininess, prettiness out of that weld, and you're gonna get that, you know, depending upon your gas coverage. And that being said, today that's going to conclude our demonstration on that particular way of welding. And this is all on flat welding. It's nothing, it's a great way to learn how to weld. You flat weld as always. And the reason we're starting this out in MIG welding is a common thing that most homeowners, a novice welder can obtain a MIG welder. Like I said, you can pick them up either at your welding supply. You can pick them up from your local hardware stores, a lot of times Lowe's, Home Depot, stuff like that. They have them. You can pick them up from them, and once you pick them up from them, let's just by these videos, it'll give you some insight on what to do with them instead of having to go through a school or college training and stuff like that. But like I said, you know, the knowledge of all these things is power. Knowledge is always power. It's great. Nobody can ever take that away from you. The more knowledge you have, the more power you have. Like I said, the flat weld here is a great weld to practice on. It's ideal getting you set up, knowing what you're looking for, telling how the wire is burning in. You don't want to go over and burn in too deep where you get what we call in the welding term an undercut. You don't want it to weld too cold where you get what we call a cold roll. And I'll demonstrate that more in other videos. But this gets you started on welding in the flat position on both ways, whether it be in a constant feed of the wire, or you know, pushing the wire, pulling the wire, or vice versa. Like I said over here, you're doing the pulse welding, and both ways are great to learn, because you get into a situation where you're trying to weld two thin pieces of metal together. And this 14 gauge material is a pretty good material to practice on, and it gives you, I mean, you can turn that heat up good, get some good weld on it. And if you was welding, like I said, with a 16 gauge, 18 gauge metal, it's gonna be a lot thinner metal. And what the pulse welding also helps you do as far as like welding, anytime you're welding, you want to, if you're connecting pieces together, you want to stagger it out. If it's a critical piece that you're building, you want to stagger it out to where you're welding some here, some there, staggered around, to where you're not constantly welding in one spot. Because if you're constantly putting heat in that one spot, it's going to create warpage. It's going to draw. It's going to draw towards where that heat's at, and that's going to cause warpage. So if you stagger those welds around, and that's what the pulse welding helps you a lot with. If you're pulse welding, you're hitting a spot here, you hit just a little bit on each spot. You can keep working it till you can control that heat to where you're not overheating that metal. But always check your metal while you're welding. Always check and observe and see if you're causing warpage. Stop. Let it cool down some. Let it cool down. Give it a few minutes to cool off, and then start back and do it in that rotation. And when you stagger it out like that, you'll achieve better results. And don't be afraid to use a grinder to clean your metal, clean the welds. If you don't think the weld came out sufficient enough for you, buff it down with a grinder some. Don't be scared to use a grinder till you learn how you're actually wanting the weld to look. Don't be afraid to use a grinder. There's no shame in it. I used to hear people say all the time, "Oh, if you know how to weld, you wouldn't need a grinder." Well, that's the whole reason why they make grinders. If you can't achieve a perfectly desired weld like you want yet, when you're first starting out, clean it up, grind it some, buff it down, paint it, whatever you want to do. But the more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. And that concludes this video. We thank you for joining us. Please like and subscribe. And as always, I tell you, if you have a comment, you have a question, please, by all means, ask. If you have suggestions for future videos and stuff like that, feel free to let us know. We thank you for allowing us to come to you, and hope you get something out of this, and that it's a great benefit to you. And again, this is Jerry Walker, Texas Welder. Thank you a lot.